Section 50 of Annual Reports to the Massachusetts Board of Education by Horace Mann. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 12th Annual Report, 1848, Part 5. It is still easier to prove that the Massachusetts school system is not anti-Christian nor unchristian. The Bible is the acknowledged expositor of Christianity. In strictness, Christianity has no other authoritative expounder. This Bible is in our common schools by common consent. 12 years ago, it was not in all the schools. Contrary to the genius of our government, if not contrary to the express letter of the law, it had been used for sectarian purposes, to prove one sect to be right and others to be wrong. Hence it had been excluded from the schools of some towns by an express vote. But since the law and the reasons on which it was founded have been more fully explained and better understood, and since sectarian instruction has to a great extent ceased to be given, the Bible has been restored. I am not aware of the existence of a single town in the state in whose schools it is not now introduced, either by a direct vote of the school committee or by such general desire and acquiescence as supersede the necessity of a vote. In all my intercourse for 12 years, whether personal or by letter, with all the school officers in the state, and with tens of thousands of individuals in it, I have never heard an objection made to the use of the Bible in school except in 1 or 2 instances, and in those cases the objection was put upon the ground that daily familiarity with the book in school would tend to impair a reverence for it. If the Bible, then, is the exponent of Christianity, if the Bible contains the communications, precepts, and doctrines which make up the religious system called and known as Christianity, if the Bible makes known those truths which, according to the faith of Christians, are able to make men wise unto salvation, and if this Bible is in the schools, how can it be said that Christianity is excluded from the schools? Or how can it be said that the school system which adopts and uses the Bible is an anti-Christian or an unchristian system? If that which is the acknowledged exponent and basis of Christianity is in the schools, by what tergiversation in language or paralogism in logic can Christianity be said to be shut out from the schools? If the Old Testament were in the schools, could a Jew complain that Judaism was excluded from them? If the Koran were read regularly and reverently in the schools, could a Mohammedan say that Mohammedanism was excluded? Or if the Mormon Bible were in the schools, could it be said that Mormonism was excluded from them? Is it not indeed too plain to require the formality of a syllogism, that if any man's creed is to be found in the Bible, and the Bible is in the schools, then that man's creed is in the schools? This seems even plainer than the proposition that 2 and 2 make 4. That is, we can conceive of a creature so low down in the scale of intelligence that he could not see what sum would be produced by adding 2 and 2 together, who still could not fail to see that if a certain system called Christianity were contained in and inseparable from a certain book called the Bible, then wherever the Bible might go, there the system of Christianity must be. If a vase of purest alabaster, filled with myrrh and frankincense and precious ointments, were in the schools, would not their perfumes be there also? And would the beautiful vase, and the sweet aroma of spice and unguent, be any more truly there if some concoctor of odors such as nature never made should insist upon saturating the air with the products of his own distillations, which, though pleasant to his idiosyncrasy, would be nauseous to everybody else? But if a man is conscious or suspicious that his creed is not in the Bible, but resolves that it shall be in the schools at any rate, then it is easy to see that he has a motive either to exclude the Bible from the school, or to introduce some other book, or some oral interpreter in company with it, to misconstrue and override it. If the Bible is in the schools, we can see a reason why a Jew who disbelieves in the mission of our Savior, or a Mohammedan who believes in that of the Prophet, should desire by oral instruction or catechism or otherwise to foist in his own views and thereby smother all conflicting views. But even they would not dare to say that the schools where the Bible was found were either anti-Christian or unchristian. So far from this, if they were candid, they would acknowledge that the system of Christianity was in the schools, and that they wished to neutralize and discard it by hostile means. And further, our law explicitly and solemnly enjoins it upon all teachers, without any exception, to exert their best endeavors to impress on the minds of children and youth committed to their care and instruction the principles of piety, justice, and a sacred regard to truth, love to their country, humanity, and universal benevolence, sobriety, industry, and frugality, chastity, moderation, and temperance, and those other virtues which are the ornament of human society, and the basis upon which a republican constitution is founded. Are not these virtues and graces part and parcel of Christianity? In other words, can there be Christianity without them? While these virtues and these duties towards God and man are inculcated in our schools, anyone who says that the schools are anti-Christian or unchristian expressly affirms that his own system of Christianity does not embrace any one of this radiant catalogue, that it rejects them all, that it embraces their opposites. And further still, our system makes it the express duty of all the resident ministers of the gospel to bring all the children within the moral and Christian inculcations above enumerated, so that he who avers that our system is an anti-Christian or an unchristian one, avers that it is both anti-Christian and unchristian for a minister of the gospel to promote or labor to diffuse the moral attributes and excellences which the statute so earnestly enjoins. So far, the argument has been of an affirmative character. Its scope and purpose show, or at least tend to show, by direct proof, that the school system of Massachusetts is not an anti-Christian nor an unchristian system. But there is still another mode of proof. The truth of a proposition may be established by showing the falsity or absurdity of all conflicting propositions. So far as this method can be applied to moral questions, its aid may safely be invoked here. What are the other courses which the state of Massachusetts might adopt or sanction in relation to the education of its youth? They are these 4. 1. It might establish schools, but expressly exclude all religious instruction from them, making them merely schools for secular instruction. 2. It might adopt a course directly the reverse of this. It might define and prescribe a system of religion for the schools, and appoint teachers and officers whose duty it should be to carry out that system. 3. It might establish schools by law, and empower each religious sect, whenever and wherever it could get a majority, to determine what religious faith should be taught in them. And 4. It might expressly disclaim and refuse all interference with the education of the young, and abandon the whole work to the hazards of private enterprise, or to parental will, ability, or caprice. As to 1, a system of schools from which all religious instruction should be excluded might properly be called unchristian, or rather non-Christian, in the same sense in which it could be called non-Jewish or non-Mohammedan, that is, as having no connection with either. I do not suppose a man can be found in Massachusetts who would declare such a system to be his first choice. 2. Were the state to establish schools and prescribe a system of religion to be taught in them, and appoint the teachers and officers to superintend it, could there be any better definition or exemplification of an ecclesiastical establishment? Such a system would create at once the most formidable and terrible hierarchy ever established upon earth. It would plunge society back into the Dark Ages at one precipitation. The people would be compelled to worship the image which the government, like another Nebuchadnezzar, might set up, and for any refusal, the fiery furnace, 7 times heated, would be their fate. And worse than this, the sacerdotal tyranny of the Dark Ages, and of more ancient as well as of more modern times, addressed its commands to men. Against men it fulminated its anathemas. On men its lightnings fell. But men had free agency. They could sometimes escape. They could always resist. They were capable of thought. They had powers of endurance. They could be upheld by a sense of duty here, and by visions of transcending rewards and glories hereafter. They could proclaim truth in the gaspings of death, on the scaffold, in the fire, in the interludes of the rack, and leave it as a legacy and a testimony to others. But children have no such resources to ward off tyranny or to endure its terrors. They are incapable of the same comprehensive survey of truth, of the same invincible resolve, of being inspired with an all-sustaining courage and endurance from the realities of another life. They would die under imprisonment, affrighted at the sight of the stake or of any of the dread machinery of torture. They would surrender their souls to be distorted into any deformity or mutilated into any hideousness. Before the process of starvation had gone on for a day, they would swallow any belief, from atheism to thuggery. For any human government, then, to attempt to coerce and predetermine the religious opinions of children by law, and contrary to the will of their parents, is unspeakably more criminal than the usurpation of such control over the opinions of men. The latter is treason against truth, but the former is sacrilege. As the worst of all crimes against chastity are those which debauch the infant victim before she knows what chastity is, so the worst of all crimes against religious truth are those which forcibly close up the avenues and bar the doors that lead to the forum of reason and conscience. The spirit of ecclesiastical domination in modern times, finding that the principles of men are too strong for it, is attempting the seduction of children. Fearing the opinions that may be developed by mature reflection, it anticipates and forestalls those opinions, and seeks to imprint upon the ignorance and receptiveness of childhood the convictions which it could never fasten upon the minds of men in their maturity. As an instance of this, the Factories Bill, so called, which in the year 1843 was submitted by Sir James Graham to the British Parliament, may be cited. Among other things, this bill provided that schools should be established in manufacturing districts under the auspices of the nation and partly at its expense. These schools were to be placed under the immediate superintendence and visitation of officers appointed by the government. No teacher was to be eligible unless approved by a bishop or archbishop. Any parent who hired out his child to work in a factory for half a day, unless he should go to this sectarian or government school the other half of the day, was to be fined, and for non-payment of the fine, imprisonment was the legal consequence. So any overseer or factory proprietor who should employ a child for half a day, who did not attend school the other half, was also subject to a fine, and of course to imprisonment if the fine were not paid. It did not at all alter the principle that in a few accepted cases, owing to the peculiar nature of the work, the children were allowed to prosecute it for a whole day, or for 2 or 3 days in succession, because just so long as they were permitted to work, just so long were they required to go to the school after the work. Nor in the great majority of cases was it any mitigation of the plan that if the parents would provide a separate school for their children at their own expense, they might send them to it, because not 1 in 10 of the operatives had either the time or knowledge to found such a school, or pecuniary ability to pay its expenses if it were founded. The direct object and effect, therefore, of the proposed law were to compel children to attend the government school and be taught the government religion, under the penalty of starvation or the poorhouse. Children were debarred from a morsel of bread unless they took it saturated with the government theology. Now, to the moral sentiments of every lover of truth, of every lover of freedom for the human soul, is there not a meanness, is there not an infamy in such a law, compared with which the bloody statutes of Elizabeth and Mary were magnanimous and honorable? To bring the awful forces of government to bear upon and to crush such lofty and indomitable souls as those of Latimer and Cranmer, of Ridley and Rogers, one would suppose to be diabolical enough to satisfy the worst spirits in the worst regions of the universe. But for a government to doom its children to starvation unless they will say its catechism, and to imprison the parent and compel him to hear the wailings of his own famishing offspring, compel him to see them perish physically by starvation or morally by ignorance, unless he will consent that they shall be taught such religious doctrines as he believes will be a peril and a destruction to their immortal souls, is it not the essence of all tyrannies, of all crimes, and of all baseness concreted into one? Such a system as this stands in the strongest possible contrast to the Massachusetts system. Will those who call our system unchristian and anti-Christian adopt and practice this system as Christian and religious? 3. As a third method, the government might establish schools by law and empower each religious sect, whenever and wherever it could get a majority, to determine what religious faith shall be taught in them. Under such a system, each sect would demand that its own faith should be inculcated in all the schools, and this on the clear and simple ground that such faith is the only true one. Each differing faith, believed in by all of the other sects, must, of course, be excluded from the schools, and this on the equally clear and simple ground that there can be but one true faith, and which that is has already been determined and is no longer an open question. Under such a system, it will not suffice to have the Bible in the schools speak for itself. Each sect will rise up and virtually say, although the Bible from Genesis to Revelation is in the schools, yet its true meanings and doctrines are not there. Christianity is not there unless our commentary, our creed, and our catechism is there also. A revelation from God is not sufficient. Our commentary or our teacher must go with it to reveal what the revelation means. Our book or our teacher must be superadded to the Bible, as an appendix or an erratum is subjoined at the end of a volume to supply oversights and deficiencies, and to rectify the errors of the text. It is not sufficient that the Holy Ghost has spoken by the mouth of David. It is not sufficient that God has spoken by the mouth of all his holy prophets, which have been since the world began. It is not sufficient that you have the words of one who spoke as never man spoke. All this leaves you in fatal ignorance and error unless you have our addenda and corrigenda, our things to be supplied and things to be corrected. Nay, we affirm that without our interpretation and explanation of the faith which was once delivered unto the saints, all that the Holy Ghost and God and Christ have promulgated and taught to men still leaves your system an unchristian and anti-Christian system. To accept a revelation directly from Jehovah is not enough. His revelation must pass through our hands. His infinite mind must be measured and squared by our minds. We have sat in council over his law, his promises, and his threatenings, and have decided definitively, unappealably, and forever upon the only true interpretation of them all. Your schools may be like the noble Bereans, searching the Scriptures daily, but unless the result of those searchings have our countersign and endorsement, those schools are unchristian and anti-Christian. Now it is almost too obvious to be mentioned that such a claim as the above reduces society at once to this dilemma. If one religious sect is authorized to advance it for itself, then all other sects are equally authorized to do the same thing for themselves. The right being equal among all the sects, and each sect being equally certain and equally determined, what shall be done? Will not each sect, acting under religious impulses, which are the strongest impulses that ever animate the breast of man, will not each sect do its utmost to establish its supremacy in all the schools? Will not the heats and animosities engendered in families and among neighbors burst forth with a devouring fire in the primary or district school meetings? And when the inflammable materials of all the district meetings are gathered together in the town meeting, what can quell or quench the flames till the zealots themselves are consumed in the conflagration they have kindled? Why would not all those machinations and oppressions be resorted to in order to obtain the ascendancy, if religious proselytism should be legalized in the schools, which would be resorted to, as I have endeavored in a preceding part of this report to explain, if political proselytism were permitted in the schools? Suppose at last that different sects should obtain predominance in different schools, just as is done by different religions in the different nations in Europe, so that in one school one system of doctrines should be taught to the children under the sanctions of law as eternal truth, and in the neighboring schools other and opposite systems should also be taught as eternal truth. Under such circumstances, perhaps it is not too much to suppose that although some of the weaker sects might be crushed out of existence at once, yet that all the leading denominations with their divisions and subdivisions would have their representative schools. Into these their respective catechisms and articles of faith would be introduced. And though the Bible itself might accompany them, yet if we may judge from the history of all the religious struggles by which the world has been afflicted, the Bible would become the incident, and the catechism and articles the principal. And if these various catechisms or articles do declare, as is averred by each party, what the Bible means, and what the Christian religion is, then what a piebald, heterogeneous, and self-contradictory system does Christianity become? Suppose these schools to be brought nearer together, within hearing distance of each other, how discordant are the sounds they utter? Bring them under the same roof, remove partition or other architectural barrier, so that they may occupy the same apartment, so that the classes may sit side by side, and does the spectacle which they now exhibit illustrate the one indivisible, all-glorious system of Christianity, or is it a return of Babel? Would such a system as this be called Christian by those who denounce our system as anti-Christian? Is there not, on the contrary, an unspeakable value in the fact that under the Massachusetts system the Bible is allowed to speak for itself? Under a system opposite to ours, this right of speaking for itself would never be vouchsafed to it. And how narrow is the distance between those who would never allow the Bible to be read by the people at all, and those who will allow it to be read only in the presence of a government interpreter? If government and teachers really believe that the Bible is the Word of God, as strictly and literally given by His inspiration, as the tables of the law which Moses brought down from the mount were written by his finger, then they cannot deny that when the Bible is read, God speaks just as literally and truly as an orator or a poet speaks when his oration or poem is rehearsed. With this belief, it is no figure of speech to say when the lids of the Bible are opened in school that its oracles may be uttered, that the lips of Jehovah are opened that he may commune with all his children of whatever faith who may be there assembled. Is that a time and an occasion for a worm of the dust, a creature of yesterday, to rush in and close the book and silence the Eternal One, that he may substitute some form of faith of his own, some form either received from tradition or reasoned out or guessed by his fallible faculties, and impose it upon the children as the plainer and better Word of God? Or when the allotted hour for religious instruction comes, or the desire arises in the teacher's mind that the children of the school should hold communion with their Heavenly Father, suppose that the Father, instead of the medium of the Bible, should send an angel from his throne to make known to them his commands and his benedictions by living lips and in celestial words? Would that be a time for the chiefs of 20 different sects to rush in with their 20 different catechisms and thrust the heavenly messenger aside and struggle to see which could out-vociferate the rest in proclaiming what the visitant from on high was about to declare? I hold it, then, to be one of the excellences, one of the moral beauties of the Massachusetts system, that there is one place in the land where the children of all the different denominations are brought together for instruction, where the Bible is allowed to speak for itself, one place where the children can kneel at a common altar and feel that they have a common Father, and where the services of religion tend to create brothers and not Ishmaelites. If this be so, then it does violence to truth to call our system anti-Christian or unchristian. Thus far, under this head, I have supposed that the different sects, in their contests for supremacy, would keep the peace. But every page in the history of polemic struggles shows such a supposition to be delusive. In the contests for victory, success would lead to haughtiness, and defeat to revenge. Affinities and repulsions would gather men into bodies. These bodies would become battalions and would set themselves in hostile array against each other. Weakness of argument would reinforce itself by strength of arm, and the hostile parties would appeal from the tribunal of reason to the arbitrament of war. But after cities had been burned and men slaughtered by thousands, and every diabolical passion in the human breast satiated, and the combatants were forced from mere exhaustion to rest upon their arms, it would be found, on a re-examination of the controverted grounds, that not a rule of interpretation had been altered, not the tense of a single verb in any disputed text had been changed, not a Hebrew point nor a Greek article had been added or taken away, but that every subject of dispute remained as unsettled and uncertain as before. Is any system which by the law of the human passions leads to such results either Christian or religious? 4. One other system, if it may be so called, is supposable, and this exhausts the number of those which stand in direct conflict with ours. It is this: government might expressly disclaim and refuse all interference with the education of the young, abandoning the whole work to the hazards of private enterprise, or to parental will, ability, or caprice. The first effect of this course would be the abandonment of a large portion of the children of every community to hopeless and inevitable ignorance. Even with all the aids, incitements, and bounties now bestowed upon education by the most enlightened states in this Union, there exists a perilous and a growing body of ignorance animated by the soul of vice. Were government systems to be abolished and all government aid to be withdrawn, the number of American children who in the next generation would be doomed to all the wants and woes that can come in the train of ignorance and error would be counted by millions. This abandoned portion of the community would be left without any of the restraints of education to work out the infinite possibilities of human depravity. In the more favored parts of the country, the rich might educate their own children, although it is well known even now that throughout the extensive regions of the South and West, the best education which wealth can procure is meager and stinted, and alloyed with much error. The parochial or sectarian system might effect something in populous places, but what could it do in rural districts, where so vast a proportion of all the inhabitants of this country reside? In speaking of the difficulties of establishing schools at the West, Miss Beecher gives an account of a single village which she found there, consisting of only 400 inhabitants, where there were 14 different denominations. Of the most numerous portions of these, she says, each was jealous lest another should start a church first and draw in the rest. The result was, neither church nor Sunday school of any kind was in existence. Of another place, she says, "I found two of the most influential citizens arrayed against each other and supported by contending partisans, so that whatever school one portion patronized, the other would oppose. The result was, no school could be raised large enough to support any teacher." And again, "In another large town, I was informed by one of the clergymen that no less than 20 different teachers opened schools and gave them up in about 6 months. In a population of 400, there would be about 100 children who ought to attend school. Although this proportion, on an average of the whole country, is nearly threefold the number of actual attendants. 100 children would furnish the materials for a good school, but divided between 14 different schools would give only 7 children and 1/7 of a child to each school. How impossible to sustain schools on such a basis! The more numerous sects, it is true, would have a larger proportion, but just so much less would be the proportion of the smaller sects, and doubtless there would be some who would be fully represented by the above-mentioned fraction of 1/7 of a child. But let us take the case of Massachusetts, where the population has a density of 5 times the average of the other states in the Union, and let us see how insane and suicidal would be such a course of policy even with us. Leaving out all the cities, there are 305 towns in Massachusetts, and these comprise most of the rural and sparsely populated portion of the state. These 305 towns have an average of 11 schools, wanting a very small fraction, for each. 226 of these 305 towns have a population, according to the last census, of less than 2,200 each. If there are 2,200 inhabitants and 11 schools in a town, each school represents an average of 200 inhabitants. Including every child who was found in all our public schools last year, for any part either of the summer or winter terms, they would make a mean average for those terms of only 48 to a school. Now suppose those 48 scholars to be divided not between 14, but only between 4 different denominations, there would be but 12 to a school. Connect this result with the fact that Massachusetts has a population 5 times as dense as the average of the residue of the nation, and it will be seen by intuition that only in a few favored localities could a system of sectarian schools be maintained. This obstacle might be partially overcome by a union of 2 or more sects, between whom the repellency resulting from some punctilios in matters of form or ceremonial observance would not overcome the argument from availability. But this union, having been purchased by the sacrifice of a portion of what each holds to be absolute truth, why, when any one of the allies should become sufficiently powerful to stand alone, would it not dissolve the alliance, set up for itself, and abandon its confederates to their fate? In making the above computation, which gives an average of 48 scholars to each school, it will be observed that all the schools in the state are included, the numerously attended schools of the cities as well as the small ones of the country. And although the number of districts in the 226 towns whose population is less than 2,200 each may be somewhat less than in the remaining 79 towns, yet the fact unquestionably is that an allowance of 48 scholars to a school is much too large an average for the schools in these 226 of the 305 towns of the state. Of course, 12 scholars to a school would be much too large an average if the schools were divided only between 4 different sects. Nor has any mention been made of the large numbers who connect themselves with no religious sect, and who, therefore, if united at all, would be united on the principle of opposition to sect. Surely the very statement of the case supersedes argument in regard to the possibility of maintaining schools for any considerable portion of the children of the country on such a basis. The calamities necessarily resulting from so partial and limited a system as the one now under consideration, would inflict retributive loss and weakness upon all classes in the community, but upon the children of the poor, the ignorant, and the unfortunate would the blow fall with the most terrible severity. And what class of children ought we most assiduously to care for? Christ came to save that which would otherwise be lost. All good men and all governments, so far as they imitate the example of Christ, strive to succor the distressed, and to reclaim the guilty, in an intellectual and in a moral sense, to feed the hungry, to clothe the naked, to visit the sick and the imprisoned, amid the priceless wealth of character, to find the lost piece of silver, and amid the wanderings from the fold of truth, to recover the lambs. Before heaven, it is now, today, the first duty of every government in Christendom to bring forward those unfortunate classes of people who in the march of civilization have been left in the rear. Though the van of society should still stand for a century, the rear ought to be brought up. The exterminating decree of Herod was parental and beneficent, compared with the cruel sway of those rulers who dig pitfalls of temptation along the pathway of children, and suffer them to fall, unwarned and unassisted, into the abysses of ruin. What then shall be said of that opposition to our system, which, should it prevail, would doom to remediless ignorance and vice a great majority of all the children in this land? Is such a system, as contradistinguished from our free system, Christian and religious? It is a very surprising fact, but one which is authenticated by a report made in the month of July last by a committee of the Boston primary schools, that of the 10,162 children belonging to said schools, 5,154 were of foreign parentage. Let sectarianism be introduced into the Boston schools, or rather let it be understood that the schools are to be carried on for the avowed purpose of building up any one of the New England denominations, and what a vast proportion of these 5,154 children would be immediately withdrawn from the schools. Their parents would as soon permit them to go to Eleazar House as to such schools, and this too from the sincerest of motives. The same thing would prove relatively true in regard to no inconsiderable numbers of the less populous cities and of the most populous towns in the state. Now, what would be the condition of such children at the end of 20 years? And what the condition of the communities which had thus cruelly closed the schoolhouse doors to them? Would not these communities be morally responsible for all the degradation, the miseries, the vices, and the crimes consequent upon such expulsion from the school? And would such a result be one of the fruits of a Christian and religious system? But there would be another inseparable accompaniment of such a system. In Massachusetts, the average compensation paid to male teachers is very much larger than that which is paid in any other state in the Union. It is nearly double what is given in most of the states. And yet, even with us, the great body of ambitious and aspiring young men pass by the profession of teaching, and betake themselves to some other employment known to be more lucrative, and falsely supposed to be more honorable. How degrading, then, must be the effect upon the general character and competency of teachers as a profession, when, on the abolition of the public schools, and the substitution of private and sectarian schools in their stead, the wages of teachers for the poorer classes shall be reduced to a pittance, and the collection of even this pittance shall be precarious. What will be the social rank and standing of teachers when their customary income encourages no previous preparation for their work, doles out only a niggardly subsistence even while they are engaged in the service, and leaves no surplus for the probable wants of sickness or the certain ones of age? And among whom shall the teacher seek his associates, when he is shunned by the learned for his want of culture, and ridiculed for his poverty by the devotees of wealth? Even in England, where the population is so dense that hardly a spot can be selected as a center which will not embrace within a circumference of convenient distance a sufficient number of children for a school, even there the voluntary and sectarian system leaves at least 2/3 of the agricultural and manufacturing classes in a state of the most deplorable ignorance, supplying them with teachers, so far as it supplies them with teachers at all, who fulfill the double office of perpetuating errors in school and degrading the character of the profession out of it. There is another fact of fearful significance which no one who has any regard for the common interests of society can be pardoned for forgetting. It is known to all that in many parts of the Union the population is so sparse and can command so little of ready means for paying salaries that no resident clergyman of any denomination is to be found throughout wide districts of the country, and many of those who do devote themselves to the spiritual welfare of their fellow men are most scantily provided for. If unmarried, they can barely live. If they have a family, there is oftentimes a real scantiness of the comforts and necessaries of life. They have neither books to peruse, nor leisure to read, even if they had books. They may be a pious, but they cannot be a learned clergy. At least in one respect they are compelled to imitate St. Paul, for as he wrought at his own craft for a subsistence, so must they. If existing means are too scanty to give a respectable support even to the ministry, how disastrous must be the effect of dividing these scanty means between the institution of the gospel and the institution of the school? Will not the vineyard of the Lord be overgrown with weeds? Will not its hedges be broken down, and the wild beasts of the forest make their lair therein, if the servants who are set to tend and to dress it are so few in number and so miserably provided for? Is not this another criterion by which to determine whether our present system is not as Christian and as religious as that which would supplant it? I know of but one argument, having a semblance of plausibility, that can be urged against this feature of our system. It may be said that if questions of doctrinal religion are left to be decided by men for themselves, or by parents for their children, numerous and grievous errors will be mingled with the instruction. Doubtless the fact is so. If truth be one, and if many contradictory dogmas are taught as truth, then it is mathematically certain that all the alleged truths but one is a falsity. But though the statement is correct, the inference which is drawn from it in favor of a government standard of faith is not legitimate. For all the religious errors which are believed in by the free mind of man, or which are taught by free parents to their children, are tolerable and covetable, compared with those which the patronage and seductions of government can suborn men to adopt, and which the terrors of government can compel them to perpetuate. The errors of free minds are so numerous and so various that they prevent any monster error from acquiring the ascendancy, and therefore truth has a chance to struggle forward amid the strifes of the combatants. But if the monster error can usurp the throne of civil power, fortify itself by prescription, defend its infallibility with all the forces of the state, sanctify its enormities under sacred names, and plead the express command of God for all its atrocities, against such an antagonist truth must struggle for centuries, bleed at every pore, be wounded in every vital part, and can triumph at last only after thousands and tens of thousands of her holiest disciples shall have fallen in the conflict. If, then, a government would recognize and protect the rights of religious freedom, it must abstain from subjugating the capacities of its children to any legal standard of religious faith with as great fidelity as it abstains from controlling the opinions of men. It must meet the unquestionable fact that the old spirit of religious domination is adopting new measures to accomplish its work, measures which, if successful, will be as fatal to the liberties of mankind as those which were practiced in the bygone days of violence and terror. These new measures are aimed at children instead of men. They propose to supersede the necessity of subduing free thought in the mind of the adult by forestalling the development of any capacity of free thought in the mind of the child. They expect to find it easier to subdue the free agency of children by binding them in fetters of bigotry than to subdue the free agency of men by binding them in fetters of iron. For this purpose, some are attempting to deprive children of their right to labor and, of course, of their daily bread, unless they will attend a government school and receive sectarian instruction. Some are attempting to withhold all means even of secular education from the poor, and thus punish them with ignorance, unless, with the secular knowledge which they desire, they will accept theological knowledge which they condemn. Others still are striving to break down all free public school systems where they exist, and to prevent their establishment where they do not exist, in the hope that on the downfall of these their system will succeed. The sovereign antidote against these machinations is free schools for all, and the right of every parent to determine the religious education of his children. This topic invites far more extended exposition, but this must suffice. In bidding an official farewell to a system with which I have been so long connected, to which I have devoted my means, my strength, my health, 12 years of my time, and doubtless twice that number of years from what might otherwise have been my term of life, I have felt bound to submit these brief views in its defense. In justice to my own name and memory, in justice to the board of which I was originally a member, and from which I have always sought counsel and guidance, and in justice to thousands of the most wise, upright, and religious-minded men in Massachusetts, who have been my fellow laborers in advancing the great cause of popular education under the auspices of this system, I have felt bound to vindicate it from the aspersions cast upon it, and to show its consonance with the eternal principles of equity and justice. I have felt bound to show that, so far from being an irreligious, anti-Christian, or unchristian system, it is a system which recognizes religious obligations in their fullest extent, that it is a system which invokes a religious spirit, and can never be fitly administered without such a spirit, that it inculcates the great commands upon which hang all the law and the prophets, that it welcomes the Bible, and therefore welcomes all the doctrines which the Bible really contains, and that it listens to these doctrines so reverently that for the time being it will not suffer any rash mortal to thrust in his interpolations of their meaning, or to overlay the text with any of the many inventions which the heart of man has sought out. It is a system, however, which leaves open all other means of instruction, the pulpit, the Sunday schools, the Bible classes, the catechisms of all the denominations, to be employed according to the preferences of individual parents. It is a system which restrains itself from teaching that what it does teach is all that needs to be taught, or that should be taught, but leaves this to be decided by each man for himself, according to the light of his reason and conscience, and on the responsibility of that great being who, in holding him to an account for the things done in the body, will hold him to the strictest account for the manner in which he has trained up his children. Such, then, in a religious point of view, is the Massachusetts system of common schools. Reverently it recognizes and affirms the sovereign rights of the Creator. Sedulously and sacredly it guards the religious rights of the creature, while it seeks to remove all hindrances and to supply all furtherances to a filial and paternal communion between man and his Maker. In a social and political sense, it is a free school system. It knows no distinction between rich and poor, of bond and free, or between those who, in the imperfect light of this world, are seeking through different avenues to reach the gate of heaven. Without money and without price it throws open its doors, and spreads the table of its bounty for all the children of the state. Like the sun, it shines not only upon the good but upon the evil that they might become good, And like the rain, its blessings descend not only upon the just, but upon the unjust, that their injustice may depart from them and be known no more. To the great founders of this system we look back with filial reverence and love. Amid the barrenness of their land, and in utter destitution of wealth, they coined the rude comforts and even the necessaries of life into means for its generous support. Though as laborers by day they subdued the wilderness, and as sentinels by night they guarded the camp, yet they found time for the vigilant administration and oversight of the schools in the day of their infancy and weakness. But for this single institution, into which they transfused so much of their means and of their strength, and of which they have made us the inheritors, how different would our lot and our life have been? Upon us its accumulated blessings have descended. It has saved us from innumerable pains and perils that would otherwise have been our fate, from the physical wretchedness that is impotent to work out its own relief, from the darkness of the intellect whose wanderings after light so often plunge it into deeper gloom, and from the moral debasement whose pleasures are vices and crimes. It has surrounded us with a profusion of comforts and blessings, of which the most poetic imagination would never otherwise have conceived. It has found not mythologic goddesses, but gigantic and tireless laborers in every stream, not evil and vindictive spirits, but beneficent and helping ones in all the elements. And by a profounder alchemy than schoolmen ever dreamed of, it transmutes quarries and ice fields into gold. It has given cunning to the hand of the mechanic, keenness to the artisan's eye, and made a sterile soil grow grateful beneath the skill of the husbandman. Hence the absence of poverty among our native population, hence a competency for the whole people, the means for mental and moral improvement, and for giving embellishment and dignity to life, such as the world has never known before, and such as nowhere else can be found upon the face of the earth. How divinely wise were our Pilgrim Fathers when they foresaw that if they could give knowledge and virtue to their children, they gave them all things. Wonder and admiration seize us as we reflect upon the vastness of the results which their wisdom wrought out from the scantiest of resources. They have taught us the great lesson, how the fiercest elements obey, and how the most obdurate and intractable of nature's substances bend and melt before the power of knowledge and the fervors of a saintly heroism. Their deeds have taught us not only that the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, but they have taught us that the swiftness which shall win the honors of the goal, and the strength that shall triumph in the strife, are to be found in the soul, not in the limbs of man. But though to this untitled yet noblest ancestry we are bound to pay the homage of our gratitude, and to accept their benefactions with a filial love, yet neither the complacency of enjoyment nor that of retrospection is the frame of mind that best befits us. We have our futurity as they had theirs, a futurity rapidly hastening upon us, a futurity now fluid, ready as clay in the hands of the potter, to be molded into every form of beauty and excellence. But so soon as it reaches our hands, so soon as it receives the impress of our plastic touch, whether this touch be for good or for evil, it is to be struck into the adamant of the unchanging and unchangeable past. Into whose form and likeness shall we fashion this flowing futurity? Of Mammon, of Moloch, or of Jesus? Clear and more clear out of the dimness of coming time emerge to the vision of faith the myriad hosts of the generations that shall succeed us. These generations are to stand in our places, to be called by our names, and to accept the heritage of joy or of woe which we shall bequeath them. Shall they look back upon us with veneration for our wisdom and beneficent forecast, or with shame at our selfishness and degeneracy? Our ancestors were noble examples to us. Shall we be ignoble examples to our posterity? They gave from their penury. Shall we withhold from our abundance? Let us not dishonor our lineage. Let us remember that generosity is not to be measured by the largeness of the sum which a man may give, but by the smallness of the sum which remains to him after his gift. Let us remember that the fortunes of our children and of their descendants hang upon our fidelity, just as our fortunes were suspended upon the fidelity of our fathers. Deeds survive the doers. In the highest and most philosophic sense, the asserted brevity of human life is a fiction. The act remains, though the hand that wrought it may have perished. And when our spirits shall have gone to their account, and the dust of our bodies shall be blown about by the wind or mingled with the waves, the force which our life shall have impressed upon the machinery of things will continue its momentum, and work out its destiny upon the character and happiness of our descendants. But not the fortunes of our children alone, or of our children's children, are dependent upon us. The influences of our conduct extend outward in space as well as onward in time. We are part of a mighty nation which has just embarked upon the grandest experiment ever yet attempted upon earth, the experiment of the capacity of mankind for the wise and righteous government of themselves. Fearful are the issues which hang upon the trial, but few and simple the conditions that predestine its result. The firmament, though pillared upon rottenness, shall be upheld, and the light of day shall continue to revisit the earth, though the sun be blotted out, sooner than that a republic shall stand which has not knowledge and virtue for its foundations. Yet are we not braving the results of this experiment in impious defiance of the conditions on which heaven has decreed the trial shall turn? Within a brief period of time, our population has spread itself westward from the Atlantic through more than 20 degrees of longitude. It has erected 30 states and given to each a republican frame of government. Yet in more than one half of these states, no provision worthy of the name is made for replenishing the common mind with knowledge, or for training the common heart to virtue. Surely to the people of these states a different mental and moral culture must come speedily, or it will come too late, and the sower who would scatter the elements of knowledge and virtue amongst them must press forward with gigantic strides and cast his seed with a gigantic arm. Nor is this all. Beyond our western frontier, another and wider realm spreads out, as yet unorganized into governments and uninhabited by civilized man. The western is still broader than the eastern expanse. It stretches through 30 degrees of longitude, 1/12th part of the circumference of the globe. Half the population of continental Europe might be transplanted to it, find subsistence on it, and leave room to spare. It is now a waste more dreary than desolation itself, for it is filled only with savage life. Yet soon will every rood of its surface be explored by the centrifugal force of the Saxon soul, and whatever of vegetable wealth is spread upon it, or of mineral wealth is garnered beneath it, will be appropriated by the vehemence of Saxon enterprise. Shall this new empire, wider than that of the Ptolemies, and almost as extensive as that of the Caesars, be reclaimed to humanity, to a Christian life and a Christian history? Or shall it be a receptacle where the avarice, the profligacy, and the licentiousness of a corrupt civilization shall cast its criminals and breed its monsters? If it is ever to be saved from such a perdition, the mother states of this union, those states where the institutions of learning and religion are now honored and cherished, must send out their hallowing influences to redeem it. And if, in the benignant providence of God, the tree of paradise is ever to be planted and to flourish in this new realm, if its branches are to spread, and its leaves to be scattered for the healing of the people, will not the heart of every true son of Massachusetts palpitate with desire, not a low and vainglorious ambition, but such a high and holy aspiration as angels might feel, that her name may be engraved upon its youthful trunk, there to deepen and expand with its immortal growth. End of Section 50. End of Annual Reports to the Massachusetts Board of Education by Horace Mann. Recording by Maria Kasper.